All right, almost finished with this amp of Keith Williams, this GA-40 clone. You can see I've not reinstalled a master volume yet. The one that was in there was not optimal, let's put it nicely, and he was never happy with it. And later in this video, I'll talk about the master volume that was in there, why that didn't work, and what our option is going to be, our better choice going forward. So you can see here, I've got some new Switchcraft jacks here with matching hardware. Everything is nice and clean and tight. It's got new alpha 3/8-inch bushing pots, some new knobs that aren't cracked, look just like the old ones, but without the cracks. Let me go through and show you some of the more important things that I've done. All right, you can see the switch to bridge the channels has been mounted flush. You'll see it from the other side a little bit. You can see it's got new octal sockets. And these two octal sockets are rotated so that pins 4 and 5 are on the outside here because these are 5879s and they don't have a connection for heater at pin 9, so just 4 and 5. So those are out here, well away from anything else. And all the wires have been replaced going to them, connected beneath the board. You'll see that a different view of that. All the wiring is done very neatly, so I've got a ground reference for pins 2 and 6. And then 3 and 9 are the cathode on each 5879. And the kind of flimsy, janky, up in the air, vibration-prone resistors here have been replaced. He had 51Ks in there, like the GA-40. I did not have those. I did not order those. I put in some 56Ks. No one will hear any difference between 56K and 51K. It's just one of those odd values that Gibson used back in the day. So these are Belton sockets. And you can see the heater wiring there. Tightly twisted, not that it really matters all that much in this case, but it's a way of keeping the wiring together and making everything lay out neatly. Moving down here, you can see on this 12AX7 for the phase inverter, it has been rotated so that pins 4 and 5 are here and pin 9 is here. So the heater wiring goes through the center, well away from the two grids. And again, the wiring has all been redone. Same for this CA7, 6S, I can't remember the thing. Anyway, the big octal preamp tube for the tremolo. All that stuff's been done neatly and very good secure mechanical connections. It's not just going through a hole with some solder. And it should be rock solid. You can see that it's got the new foot switch jack, new speaker jack, new auxiliary speaker jack, and the power switch all wired up after the fuse on the hot only. And I showed this stuff in the previous video, but it's moved a bit farther since then. So I've got some grid stoppers here mounted on pins 6 to 5, not connected to the grids yet. That'll come later for reasons which will soon become apparent. And you can see here on this one, I've got some 100 ohm half-watt resistors from each side of the heater to the cathode, because the cathodes can be elevated about 20 volts, which gives you a nice free DC elevation heater reference, nice and quiet, and should have very little hum, if any. You can see here I have all new Vichy filter caps, so 20, 10, 10, 10, and they're all very neatly done. And the new cathode bypass cap is down here. And you can see I moved the actual cathode resistor up in the air, well away from these two electrolytics so that the heat from this doesn't bake any of these caps. And you can see here there's a split in the ground. These three caps are all tied to the preamp ground, which goes all the way to the beginning and is tied to the input. The reservoir cap, this first cap, its ground is going over here, where the HT center tap ground is. You can see that here, and you can see that the power transformer is no longer being mounted with that piece of plastic between it and the chassis to hold these wires. So it is directly coupled to the chassis, and these wires are still taped off and they're held in place just by tension. They're not going anywhere. These are unused primaries for different voltages this amp could have been used with, this transformer could have been used with. And over to the left here, all the wire that was in this area where the screws come down has all been dressed away from there. Here you can see the Keps nuts mounting the output transformer because the old nuts were just plain nuts and they were vibrated loose. You can get a sense of the wiring here. This is all 20 gauge Teflon coated stranded silver tinned, good stuff. And 22 is more than sufficient for the current. I like the 20 because it kind of holds its shape better. The 22 is a little bit loose and can be a bit floppy. This 20 behaves a little more like solid core without being prone to being microphonic or vibration issues. And you can see I've got blues for all the plate connections. I've got yellow for all the cathode connections and greens for the grids where the greens aren't shielded. This is some Canary GS4 here for the shielded run. And that same color scheme is used there for the other preamp tube sockets. Here you can see the remounted switch doesn't protrude from the chassis as much, so when it's in the cabinet, it's less likely to get sheared off in transit. Same for the power switch that I already showed you. The old black beauties are gone. I have these nice 418 series polyester orange drops in place here. Everything else on the board, pretty much with the one exception that I'll mention in a minute, is exactly what Keith did, and he did a very good job. He was very careful, very neat layout for everything he did on the board. He spent a lot of time on that. It shows, and it's well worth spending time on to get things just right. The only other things, other than the main thing about the master volume I'll get to in a minute, that I changed out were the cathode bypass caps. So it's got 4 Vishay 63 volt 22 microfarad caps. No big deal. The caps he'd used were fine, but that was 15 years ago, so it was time to replace them. Now, as the amp came to me, Keith had the 100K from here and the 470K from here, all going to right here, which was not connected to ground as it is now. This eyelet was just used as a junction for those 2 resistors. And then there was a shielded wire connected there with a shield over here, which was running to the input of the phase inverter. I found that was structurally not very good. Had required very long runs on the resistor, and the old wire was too taut. So I have put these resistors, half-watt carbon films, mounted here on the volume pots, so 100K and 470K, and where the junction is, that's where the canary is connected, and it's shielded there. And so that gives the same electronic circuit, but it means that if you need to lift the board up, you're not putting a whole bunch of strain on these resistors because they can snap, and that's very common in old amps which have resistors running long distances unsupported. I made the decision to do all the connections going to the tube sockets from the bottom of the board, which makes it very neat looking, but all the connections going to the pots coming from the top of the board, which makes the entire thing very easy to service in the future. You take out the 4 screws that hold the board in place, you separate the pots from the front panel, and then everything lifts up together. And it's a very intuitive way to work on this, though. No more work should be necessary on this probably for another 20 years. But it's still nice to plan things out that way. And the wire like this, especially when the thing's in its cabinet and it'll have some shielding up here where it contacts the cabinet, this is all going to be very, very quiet and reliable. And the microphonics from the old solid core twisted stuff should be gone. Now here you can see one changed out resistor. There's another one right here. And where this resistor goes has been moved from here at this ground point to here, and there's nothing tying them. And I have these wires going off to nowhere, and an empty hole where the master volume is, and an unused ground wire that's in preparation for the new master volume pot. And that's all going to be put to very good use very soon when the last part arrives, which is actually the parts, 2 parts, a dual gang 1 meg pot for the master volume, and a 10K trimmer, which will go right here, which will let me do something cool, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the reason that this circuit did not sound very good with the previous master volume is the previous master volume was a cross line, a very simple thing. It was just a 500K between this grid and this grid. And that works okay in a long-tailed pair phase inverter, and that works okay in a cathodine phase inverter. but it doesn't work at all well in a paraphase phase inverter. And this amp, like the true GA-40 by Gibson, has a paraphase phase inverter. And before I can tell you why that cross-line master volume doesn't work well, first we need to talk about what is a paraphase phase inverter. So let's do that next. So here is a basic gain stage done with some values that are actually used in the GA-20 phase inverter. And we're not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to talk about an overview of how a phase inverter works in general and how the paraphase phase inverter works. So we start from the preamp, and we have a 630K grid leak going to ground. Then we have a 12AX7. It has a 2K cathode resistor, which is bypassed with a 10 microfarad cap, and it has a 220K plate resistor, and it has a 20 nanofarad coupling cap, which then has its own grid leak, which is a 470K to ground, and that feeds the grid of a 6V6. And if this were a single-ended amp, this is all that you would need. This is similar to what you'd find in a champ. But for a push-pull output section, we need to have the same signal present at each output tube, but we need to have it inverted. So what's important to realize about this very basic gain stage you see here is that the signal at the 6V6 grid is inverted from the signal coming from the preamp. Aside from any level differences, the signal which goes positive from the preamp goes negative to the grid of the 6V6 because a triode stage like this inverts the signal as it applies gain. So what you can do as a basic premise is just split that signal that goes off to the 6V6 grid and feed it through another triode gain stage. And I have just exactly mirrored what we did before. So we have a gain stage, which feeds the 6V6 grid, and then it feeds a second gain stage, and its output feeds the grid of the other 6V6. And because we know that second gain stage will invert the signal, the grid of the first 6V6 will be reversed polarity to the grid of the second 6V6. So that's how we have a split phase. So that's how you have one signal being positive while the other signal is negative, and that's how the phase inverter needs to work. The issue with what you see here is that second gain stage is amplifying the signal quite a bit. And what we would have if we did this would be the grid of the second 6V6 would be much, much louder, getting a much, much stronger signal. So we need to attenuate the signal going to that second gain stage so that the gain of the top signal is roughly the same as the gain of the bottom signal. So here we've accomplished that. Now ignore that little tone circuit at the top. I've added that because this is gradually becoming the circuit from the GA-20. And we're going to look at the 470K with the 7.5K resistor added to ground. And that creates a voltage divider. And at that point where the voltage is divided or attenuated, that's where we're going to take the signal that feeds the second gain stage. And by careful adjustment of that 470K to 7.5K, adjusting that voltage divider, we can set it so the signal for the positive waveform is the same level as the signal to the negative waveform. Notice also that I'm not showing two separate cathode circuits here. They are sharing a cathode, so it simplifies the parts cost, and the 2K changes to 1K, and the 10 microfarad changes to 22 microfarad. Don't worry, this won't be on the test. But it also introduces a little bit of local positive feedback, which can be nice, but again, outside the scope of this point. So right now we have signal coming in to the first tube stage, and then it goes out and it feeds the grid of one 6V6, but it is also through that attenuator, through that voltage divider, feeding the input of the next gain stage, which then feeds the other side of the power section. And if you adjust things just right, the two waveforms will have the same amplitude, the same strength, even though they're inverted in polarity. Let's redraw this a little more neatly. So here's how you might see this drawn more commonly. With the same circuit, showing the same attenuation. Everything is set up. It's beginning to look like what you'd see on the schematic for the GA-20. I've just flipped the bottom triode, so the cathode's at the top and the plate's at the bottom to make everything lay out more easily. And all that works, and that's pretty much exactly what they did in the GA-20. But when this amp came in, it had a cross-line master volume. Let me show you the addition of that cross-line master volume. It is a simple 500K pot wired as a variable resistor. So as you turn it down, the resistance between the two grids goes to 0. As you turn it up, it gets up to 500K resistance there. And that will work, as I've said, with a cathodiene phase inverter. And that will work with what's called a long-tailed pair or Schmidt phase inverter. It does not work well with the paraphase because as that signal bleeds, there's a path from the output back to the input, which then feeds the output. Follow the signal from that 20 nanofarad cap up top. Through the 470K resistor, it goes to the grid of the added tube stage, and then it comes out of its plate and goes to that 500K pot back to the 470K, which feeds the input of that added tube stage. And it throws all the math off. It's really hard to balance the tubes when that happens, and things get unstable. And if it weren't for the fact that you've got a fully bypassed cathode there with that 22 microfarad, you'd actually have feedback. But it doesn't sound that great. And even on 10, it is audible because it is a big change to the actual loading of the two triode gain stages. Each triode gain stage is calculated to have a certain amount of gain, and that calculation depends on a known load. In this case, is the top one has 470K plus 7.5K to ground, so 477.5K. And the bottom one has a 470K load to ground. But when you have that 500K in parallel with both of those things, it throws all the loading off, and it's going to be very different at different frequencies, and it's just a recipe for an unhappy amp. So what do we do instead? What I've chosen to do is I'm going to add a variation on the Larmar, which is a dual gang 1 meg master volume pot. And in order to make that work and have everything load the same, I have changed the 470Ks from the stock circuit also to 1 meg resistors. Ignore that 10K trim pot for just a moment. So by changing the 470K resistors to 1 meg and then putting 1 meg pots across them in parallel, we end up down closer to 500K, which is really almost indistinguishable from 470K. Now, given resistor variation and the variation in pots, we're probably going to be exactly the same as we would have been in the stock amp. And in fact, the stock 470K resistors that were in this amp actually measured 500K, thereabouts. So just by swapping this way, so that when the master volume's on 10, we are back to the exact stock circuit as far as the low frequency content, the high pass filter, and the load lines for the 12X7s. So each triode of the 12X7 is still having the same load, roughly 470 to 500K on its output. But with the addition of the master volume, it attenuates the signal going to the actual 6v6 grid without affecting the behavior of the interaction between the two triodes. So triode A, the top triode, is always feeding the same ratio of that signal to triode B. So and at the input of those volume pots, the dual gang pots, that signal does not change no matter where the volume pot is. It's only the grid of the 6v6 that will change because its signal going to it will be turned down. And this will be as close to a transparent master volume as you can achieve with a paraphase phase inverter. Now, notice that I have not just changed it to 1 meg and 1 meg. I still have the 7.5K there, but I've also added a 10K pot wired as a variable resistor. And that will let me go from 7.5K to 17.5K for that lower resistor in the voltage divider. And that will mean that I can balance better than in the stock circuit the level between the first triode and the second triode. So I can intentionally make the lower triode louder or quieter than the top triode, or I can match them exactly. And it's really to taste, and we'll demonstrate that when the time comes. And I can show that on a scope, the output of each signal and adjusting that trim pot, and they're the same ones. And then the bottom one gets louder, then the bottom one gets quieter. And what that changes as far as the sound and response of the amp. And that's something that within that range, it is safe to play with, and Keith can just turn the trim pot until he finds what he likes. It doesn't have to be perfectly matched. It gives us a lot more control than just the fixed value of a resistor. If I just stuck with the original 470K and 7.5K, because those resistors drift. What might be a 470K on one might be 511K on the other one. And then you know, just by the resistors, you can't control that. So by adding one inexpensive trim pot, that will give us a much better level of control than the original Gibson had, with no downside. You'll still have the original sounds. You'll just have more ability to tweak it this way or that. Before we sign off on this video, take a look at that tone circuit up top. You notice it's a 5 nanofarad cap in series with a 1 meg pot, and that pot is wired as a variable resistor going to ground. So on the surface, that's just like the tone circuit that you'd find in your guitar. Though 5 nanofarad is kind of a low value for most guitars, you might find a 22 nanofarad or 100 nanofarad more commonly. And we use a 250K pot typically in a guitar. But the circuit itself is pretty much the same, but it is being fed from the plate of that triode. So it's being fed from fairly high DC voltage. It's not being fed from AC, as we find in a guitar. And I could move it, if I wanted to the other side of that 20 nanofarad cap. But it has a neat effect on the behavior of the tube itself. It's not just rolling off highs. When it's actually applied to the plate like that, it's going to affect the actual distortion characteristics and the linearity of that triode to have frequencies rolled off at the actual plate. So the crucial thing here is that you, in a guitar, you can have a cap followed by the resistor of the pot, or you can have the resistor of the pot followed by the cap. It doesn't matter in a guitar because it's just AC. There's no voltage present. But here, the signal goes to the capacitor first, because that capacitor is going to block all the DC and just pass AC. So that way we don't have any noise, any voltage on that pot. Anyway, that's the game plan here. As soon as that dual gang 1 meg pot arrives, I'll connect these grid wires to it, and I'll connect these wires from the phase inverter to it, give it a ground reference, and then run some other twisted red and yellow wires over here to the tube sockets, and that master volume will work. And I'll add the 10K trim pot right here in series with a 7.5K, and then I'll have control over the balance between the positive and negative sides of the output. If that 7.5K doesn't give me enough range, I can always increase it to a 10K. If you wanted to do this without the trim pot, since we're scaling everything up double, it'd be a 15K resistor, not a 7.5K. But with the 10K pot, it'll give me some nice, some leeway. I can really get it exactly the way it needs to be. Anyway, until then, thanks for watching.